Hi guys, welcome back to Core HTML Mastery. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about HTML forms. Forms are an important component in many web pages, and the relevance of forms is they allow us to collect information on the users of our site. So a simple example is a login or a sign up form. When our user first visits our site, perhaps we want them to create an account, and in order to help them do that, we need to collect some data from the user. So it could be an email, real life name, desired username, password. We also use forms for payments, for example. Let's say we're selling a product on our site and we'd like to collect information from our user. So it could be credit card details. Once again, we use a form for that. So it's a crucial component in many web pages. We're going to have a look now at how to create simple forms in HTML. So it might not come as a huge surprise, but the tag that we use for a form element is simply called form. So we open our form tag, we close our form tag. Everything in between these two tags is going to create our HTML form. Now at the moment, we won't see anything on the page because there's no information in the form. So in order to create our form, we make use of HTML input tags. So this is another type of element. So let's create an input tag. Now an input tag needs a type attribute to specify what type of data we're going to be collecting from the user. There are quite a few of these we can make use of, and we're not going to try them all out in this lesson. We'll just try out some basic input types. But if you take a look here at the MDN web docs, we have the section input types. So we can see button, checkbox, color, date, date time, email, file, image. There's a huge amount of different types of form input. And on this page, we can see the basic look of these different types of input elements. Now, I recommend you spend some time experimenting with the different types of HTML input. Right now, we're just going to make use of some of the more common types of input, and we're going to create a sample registration form. So let's pretend we have a user that wants to sign up to our site. What do we need? Well, we want a name. We're going to take an email, and we're going to have a box for the user to input their desired password. I guess ideally we'd also have a button for the user to submit their form once it's been completed. So input type equals text. And one thing we should know about input tags is that they are self-closing. So we don't want to do something like close input. Now I refresh the page and it does still work, so you will get away with this. But depending on what your setup is, if you're using some kind of JavaScript framework, for example, you're going to get back errors and your page may not load. So although we can get away with doing this, it is incorrect HTML, and input is a self-closing tag. We've already seen some other examples of self-closing tags in this course. For example, we've seen the BR tag, which is going to take the text onto a new line. We've also seen the HR or horizontal rule tag. So neither of these need a corresponding closing tag. Now we need to add some other attributes here. One of the attributes we can add is a size. So if we specify an integer here and refresh, you can see we get a larger text input box. Normally this type of thing is done with styling. So in terms of the HTML, what do we actually need? Every input needs a name attribute. And the name that we're going to assign this data is name in this case because we are collecting the name of the user. So when we get to our next input, which is going to be input type equals email, then the name is going to be email. And when we get to our next input type, which we'll specify as password, the name is going to be password. And what usually happens is we actually have password 1 and password 2. And if you think about any time you've signed up to a website, you specify the password you'd like, but then you have to retype the password. The browser then checks if our two passwords match before it allows us to proceed with submitting the form. So we'd have something like input type equals password, name equals password 1, and we do the same thing for password 2, so we could verify that they match. Finally, we can make use of input type equals submit, and this is automatically going to generate a button for us. So let's refresh, let's have a look at our form. Now there's some obvious problems with our form at this stage. We have our input boxes, we can type in them. So this is for the name, this is for the email. Notice what happens with input type password. So you might wonder, well, they're all text, right? So why not just have for input type equals text? And that's because the behavior changes slightly depending on what the input type is. So notice for the password fields, we can type, but the value of the password is not displayed on the screen for obvious security reasons. Now, one thing we might expect with a form is for everything to appear on a separate line. And again, we'd often do that with CSS. So we just have this as a raw HTML, and then we'd get CSS to put each of the inputs on a separate line. But since we're not using CSS, we can just add a BR tag after each of these inputs, and it's now going to stack our form vertically. The other obvious problem with our form is that we don't know what goes where. Now, one cool attribute we can make use of is the placeholder. So if we add a placeholder attribute, this shows a specific value in the input box provided the user hasn't supplied any data. So if we set placeholder equals name, you see it says name there. So the user can come along and say, okay, I need to type my name in this box. Once the user starts typing, the placeholder disappears. If we delete the contents of that input, then we're left once again with the placeholder. So that's undoubtedly helpful, and it probably is good practice to have a placeholder for each of the inputs. So here we have placeholder equals password, and then here for the placeholder, we might have retype password, and helps if we spell placeholder correctly. So let's refresh, and now we can see the placeholders all appearing in place, so the user could actually make use of this form as it stands. However, this is not exactly what we expect to see with forms. We expect an indication of what to input in each box outside of the box. So we often expect more than just a placeholder. So a simple example is, if we just make use of a paragraph tag for now, we expect something like name, and then we have the box where the user types their name. Now this works. We could of course use a paragraph tag for this, but there's a very specific way this is normally done, and that's to make use of a label tag. And we'll see why a label tag is used after we put it in place. So we have label. Now label needs a for attribute. And inside this for attribute, we're going to specify the ID of the input we want to connect it to. So label for equals, and we're going to put name. Now, as it happens, this first input doesn't have an ID yet. So it's very common when creating these input elements, we'll specify a name attribute, but we'll also specify an ID attribute because the label can latch on to that ID attribute. So if we create label for equals name, this is now a label that is associated with the input element that has the ID of name. So inside this label, we'll put name, and then we'll close our label tag. Now you might think, what's the point? How does having a label element instead help us? Well, one interesting thing is if I click on the label, notice that my cursor appears inside that input box. In other words, that label becomes like a link to the actual input box itself. So we can see our form needs a bit more work here. So let's just type this out. So we need ID equals email, ID equals password 1, ID equals password 2, and we can add an ID here on submit, but we won't necessarily have a label for submit. But just to follow suit, ID equals submit. Let's refresh. Now we need to actually add our labels. So what we could do is let's just copy this label for, and we'll just paste this a few times. We'll paste this once above each element. So paste one here, one here. We're of course going to rename these labels. Let's refresh our page. So you can see before each input, we have a label. But of course, at the moment, all of them are pointing towards that first input box with the ID of name. So if I click on this bottom name, it still just links to the input with the ID of name. So obviously we want to change that. So if we think about our second input, we want to change this to email. Let's set that to email, probably capitalize the label itself. We'll now change this one to password. And we want to make sure it says label for password 1 because we want it to connect to the input that has the ID of password 1. So here, for example, for the next label, we'll have label for password 2. But then for the actual name, we'll specify retype password. Let's refresh. So now, for example, if I click on retype password, It actually highlights this box. If I click on password, it highlights this box. Of course, we can click on the input boxes themselves and it achieves the same thing, but it's handy functionality so the user knows which label connects to which box, especially useful if we didn't have those placeholders in place. Now, if you're like me, you're probably thinking this form doesn't look very good. We wouldn't want to see this as a registration form on any site ever. It simply just doesn't look appealing. And this is why it's good to keep in mind that HTML is not about making things look good. It's just about defining the structure. So we can use CSS to make this form look very reasonable. And I don't want you to just take my word for it. We could have, for example, some very basic styling. Again, this is CSS, so you don't need to worry too much about this right now. This is just to show you how quickly you could start to make this look like an actual form that you might use on a website. So we want some style tags. And we're going to target that form element. So if we did something like display flex, don't worry too much about what this actually does. We'll cover this in the core CSS mastery course. Flex direction column. Let's just see what those two properties do. Let's make sure our CSS is correct. Should end with a semicolon. So we can now already see our form is appearing in a column. Already starts to look more like an actual registration form, which is great. If anything, it's a bit too wide. We can fix that very easily with width 50%. Then the other thing is we might actually like that to be centered. So we could do something like margin auto. Let's refresh that. It's possible to vertically center that as well. And I'm not going to do this the proper way right now, just for time's sake. But if we set margin top 35%, let's have a look. You can see now we have a centralized login form. Of course, everything looks a little bit too close together. So one thing we could do is actually style that input element. And we could set something like margin bottom 5 pixels. Let's have a look at that. See our form starts to get spaced out. So just understand that although this doesn't look like much, the important thing is actually the information contained in the markup, not how it looks. Because how the form looks is going to be completely controlled by CSS. And that's what we're writing right now. This is not HTML we're writing. It's not really part of this course. This is CSS styling, and it controls the appearance of the data. But what we're interested in right now is just making sure the structure of this table is correct. So let's ignore the styling for now. Let's focus for a minute on that input type equals submit. Now we can see we have a button here. And another thing we can do is we can actually specify a value here. So let's change that to sign up. So notice the value attribute for input type submit constitutes the text that appears as part of that input. So we didn't want it to say submit, we wanted it to say sign up. So we've set value attribute equals sign up. Now the question is, what happens when we click sign up? So we'll take a look at that in the next part of the course. So look forward to catching you guys there.